Hi, and thanks for joining our webcast on getting your users to Office 365 and keeping them happy. I'm Paul Robichaux, Chief Technology Officer of eNow Software and an Exchange VP. And with me is the world-famous Michael Van Horenbeeck, or Dr. Van Hybrid, as we like to call him. Michael, tell the nice folks hello.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining us, and glad to be here.
So between the two of us, we're going to be giving you some guidance that you can hopefully use to help make your Office 365 migrations go more smoothly, and not only make your users in a position where they can use the service, but also in a position where they'll be actually happy about it. We all know users can be difficult to please sometimes. So to do that, we're going to start with a quick introduction and talk about some background behind the service. Move into talking about the deployment process itself and where some of the pitfalls are. And then Michael is going to share some of the hybrid headaches that he's experienced both directly and on behalf of customers over the years, because as good as hybrid connectivity is and as many uses as it has, it's not always 100% good and it's not always 100% useful. There are a few monsters lurking under the bed at some points. Then we're going to segue and start talking about ways that you can get more value out of your Office 365 deployment with effective monitoring to help you more easily and efficiently support your users who are depending on it. Microsoft has put a huge amount of energy and money behind Office 365. So right now, roughly 52% of the businesses that Microsoft has surveyed and that other organizations such as Gartner have surveyed are indicating that they're planning on moving all or some of their users to Office 365. So if you think about that, on the one hand, that's awesome. It means that in the few short years that Office 365 has been a standalone product, that Microsoft has generated huge awareness and a huge potential market, totaling something like an annualized run rate of $8 to $10 billion forecast for the next year. On the other hand, there's another 48-ish% of those businesses who don't want to move or who say they don't immediately have plans. And that speaks to some of the difficulties that people run into when they actually start trying to plan and execute a move to Office 365. So why would you consider going to the cloud in the first place? Well, one reason, and the one that we hear most often in talking to customers, is that they believe they'll save money. The idea of being able to throw all your infrastructure away and depend completely on Microsoft's infrastructure for your services is very tempting because it offers a potential for a big cost savings. But you have to keep in mind that not every forecast is accurate and that some of the things you think you can do away with, you might actually need to keep longer than you expect. Another key reason is increased functionality. Microsoft is putting more and more effort into engineering new features and services for Office 365 that don't and may never come back to on-prem. So we got the first inkling of this when Microsoft announced the Office Graph and started talking about Delve. And once they said that they weren't going to implement that on premises, that sort of set the pattern for other features that they've added that will never come back on-prem. Delve Analytics being perhaps the latest and most noticeable, but there are plenty of others. The third reason that we see organizations interested in moving to the cloud is that they're getting peer pressure. Sometimes this is generated by executives, where an executive for one company switches jobs and at her new job says, wow, I want to move us to Office 365 for an immediate cost savings. Sometimes it's generated by peer relationships between people at different companies where they share information and experiences. And frankly, Microsoft has done a really good job of promoting Office 365 as a service, advertising it, putting a lot of marketing muscle behind it to convince people that maybe they ought to consider moving. But when you do that, you have to keep in mind that moving to the cloud is not necessarily a simple cutover. More often than not, you'll find that you're going to have components on premises that you didn't have before for things such as directory synchronization and logon federation. And of course, unless you have a fairly small number of on-prem resources, it's going to take some time before you can decommission your existing on-prem servers, which means they need to be kept around for things such as mail flow and perhaps mobile device management. The other problem, or one of the other problems that a lot of people run into, is trying to understand what you manage from where. So for example, when you want to create a new shared mailbox in a hybrid environment, where do you create it? Do you create it on-prem and let it synchronize? Do you create it in the cloud? I know Michael has fought that battle quite a bit and has some pretty strong opinions about that.
Yes, indeed. And actually, it's one of the hybrid headaches that we're going to talk about is the behavior of shared mailboxes in a hybrid deployment. And some of it is just inherent to the topology of a hybrid deployment as such, and some of it is just because how different the service is, how different Office 365 is compared to what you have on premises. And then there are some, which I like to refer to as bugs. Maybe it's by design, but, things that shouldn't be, but still are the way they are. So, yeah, plenty of things to go around.
And of course, I listed public folders here because I don't think we'll ever be, public folders and PSTs will always be with us. Exchange just celebrated the 20th anniversary of the first version going RTM. We've had public folders and PSTs for 20 years. I think at least another 20 before we can confidently say that we've gotten rid of them all. So when we talk about making the transition, the idea of being able just to push a button and have all your workloads ported to the cloud sounds really good. But as a practical matter, most organizations go hybrid. Michael, maybe you can shed a little light on why that is and what people get out of that investment in setting up hybrid in the first place.
Sure, absolutely. Well, when you come to think of it, hybrid is a very flexible, way of moving to Office 365. It is, one of the only ways that you can natively, so without any third-party tools, tip your toe in the proverbial water, move a few mailboxes, and if you don't like it, move them back. But at the same time, if you have made that decision to move to Office 365, it allows you to do that at your own pace. You can move some mailboxes and keep that rich coexistence that exists between users that are fully on premises and now between users that are in both environments, which means that mail flow is just as if they were in the same environment. They can do free busy lookups, whereas other migration methods like the cutover or the stage migration options, they only have a limited form of coexistence, no or limited, right? Stage is just plain old mail flow, no free busy, or you'd have to do some trickery to make it work. Whereas in the hybrid experience, it all comes together and it's all there. Now, to get that functionality, to get that extended experience and that better end user experience, that comes at an additional cost. There is some effort you have to put in there in order to get hybrid set up, and depending on how you set it up, it means that there are additional components as well, right? There is, although I don't like the term hybrid server, it's the Exchange server taking on some of the hybrid duties, if you will. There is dirsing that comes into play. There is AFS if you want to, create that great end user experience. So it adds complexity, and there is a trade-off: flexibility, enhanced user experience versus that complexity. But still, because Microsoft has done such a grand job in making hybrid so easy through the new hybrid configuration wizard, which continues to get better and better, it's a logical choice for the majority of the customers out there. Now, one caveat though, and that's something that I'm really adamant about, is that hybrid isn't always the best choice though. But in reality, most people go for it anyway.
Those are some excellent points. One of the advantages to hybrid is that you can move people back and forth, but it only makes sense to keep it or to use it in the first place if that's a design goal. For some organizations, it really is better just to sort of hold their nose, jump in the river, and get the migration over with and move completely. Once you go to the cloud, one of the common patterns that I see repeated over and over is that people say, oh, well, gosh, after we move to the cloud, then they list a long list of things that they won't have to do anymore. I won't have to worry about backups, and I won't have to administer DAGs, and I won't have to do this, I won't have to do that. It's not that you have less work to do after you move to the cloud. It's that the nature of the work is different. So just to give one very simple example, you have to be much more attuned to what's happening with Microsoft's own environment than you do on-prem, because on-prem, as long as you have connectivity to the internet, you can send and receive mail. With a hybrid environment, that may not be the case. You may have connectivity to the internet, but you may not have connectivity into Microsoft's data center because of a problem on Microsoft's end, because of a problem on your internet service provider's end, because of a problem in a firewall or some other kind of network device that may stop mail from flowing or may stop clients from being able to reach the endpoints that they want to get to. You still have all the normal work around user management too, when a new user joins a company, when someone leaves the company, when someone comes to you and requests a shared mailbox or a public folder or something like that, that work doesn't go away. It's just the tools that you have to use shift. So that's just a super high level summary of some of the challenges you face with hybrid. But Michael and I put this slide in because there are a lot more. Maybe you want to briefly blitz through. This is probably 10 slides worth of material, but maybe you can quickly summarize it, Michael.
Oh, absolutely. And I could talk for hours about the problems in a hybrid world, but in order to make, or to best explain this, let's make an analogy. And I like to use hybrid cars, right? They're, brand new, but it's a new technology. They're still, regular gas cars, but now they have these batteries, and it's new technology. But in order to get work done on these cars, the engineer has to get trained, has to understand how these batteries work, has to understand the new technology that's put into the car, which, is an investment for that engineer, right? In order to get to work on that car. For the owner of the car, it's a different style of driving the car. It's not exactly the same. Yes, there's additional benefits, but it might not always be the right for you depending on your driving style or, how much and how often and how far you drive. Well, if you take that analogy and look at hybrid deployment, it's exactly the same thing. It's no longer only about exchange. There's new components, new technology involved. There's DIRSing, there's AFS, there's OAuth, a lot of things that are fairly new to the, general exchange administrator. But in the end, what you're doing in a hybrid deployment, in a hybrid exchange deployment, you're extending your environment into Office 365. So you're adding stuff on top of it. You're making your environment bigger, which means that there's more to look at. There are different types of outages, right? If there is an outage in Office 365 which causes your mail flow to halt, then you have to understand, is it your environment causing the outage? Is it Office 365? Is it a widespread issue in Office 365? Maybe it's your internet connection. All in all, all these components, they form a sort of complexity which normally do not exist on premises, right? And of course, things that break aren't the only things that you have to keep in mind. There is, the ongoing maintenance of the infrastructure. It's not because you're hybrid that you can forget about anything you have on premises. You still have to patch those servers if you're going to keep them. And, even if you move everyone over to Office 365, and everyone is in the cloud, then you still have to keep that one server on premises. Sure, it's less important that server. It becomes a glorified management tool, but it's still there. It's something to keep an eye on. And then, as such, those are all, combined, if you will, lots of new things to think about, which, depending on what your previous role was, might be new for you, or, the entire paradigm of how you dealt with creating users, signing licenses, which essentially on premises you don't really do. You just make sure you're covered in the licenses. It's now entirely different. So those are all really important key points to start thinking about, and we'll dive into some of the particularities, if you will, later in the slide deck.
Excellent. I want to spend a little bit of time now talking about what the process looks like for how you actually go about deploying Office 365. This is an area where Microsoft has done users a little bit of a disservice because they position Office 365 deployment as being very simple, very straightforward. And it's true. Compared to the way it was a year ago or 2 years ago or 5 years ago, it is much simpler. It's also true that for a small, simple organization, take a company, well, such as eNow, we're a great example. We have fewer than 100 employees. They're mostly in a single location. And we don't have a super complicated on-premises environment apart from our test lab. So getting us integrated with Office 365 is pretty straightforward. If you think of other organizations that are in the same boat, that's not necessarily complex, but then when you ramp up to larger organizations with multiple sites, customers in multiple countries, multiple physical locations, suddenly it gets a lot more complicated. So the first thing that we always want to see people do as part of an Office 365 migration is to plan what they're going to do. In order to effectively plan what you're going to do, it's super important to inventory what you already have on premises. So Michael and I are going to be talking a little bit later about some of the reports that Mailscape 365 offers to help you gather this visibility into your environment. But even simple things. If I gave everybody listening to this webcast right now a bet to accurately estimate within 5% how many mailboxes are in your organization. My guesstimate, based on having done this before at Ignite and MEC and whatnot, is that very few people would be able to get that close. If I extended that bet to ask, hey, how many mailboxes of a certain size range do you have, I bet the percentage who could do it would even be smaller. Michael, I don't know if that lines up with your experience or not. Do you find that people usually have a pretty accurate read of what they have in their environment, or is it sometimes a matter of guesswork?
Well, to be honest, more often than not, it is guesswork, and that is because of how organizations work, right? The IT department has knowledge about their environment, the servers they have, how their environment works, but then you've got these various business units, some of which have plenty of active mail users, some of them have mailboxes, shared mailboxes, or they have mailboxes they use as shared mailboxes, and so forth and so on. So it's sometimes really hard for IT to get deep, detailed information about how their environment is being used and why it's being used that way.
Makes perfect sense. So having good visibility into how many objects you have, how big they are, where they're located, how important they are to the migration, super important. Another problem we very commonly find when people get ready to start a migration, they don't have a good handle on which versions of which clients they have deployed for what users. That becomes important because of Microsoft's support policy around both browser-based clients for SharePoint Online and Skype Online, and of course Outlook Web App, but also for desktop. You have to have a supported version of Outlook, and that sounds very simplistic on its face, because of course you have to have a supported version of Outlook. But if you have 10,000 users, how do you know which users have which versions? How do you know whether or not you have pockets of Outlook 2007 or say Outlook 2010 SP2 in a remote office or branch office somewhere? Gathering that data beforehand means that you greatly reduce the risk of making a change in the environment that breaks email for people. After you've gathered an accurate inventory, as accurate as you can possibly make it, and use that to drive your migration plan so that you know which objects you're moving in what order, from where to where, and have started communicating that to users. That's another really important piece that sometimes people leave out. You're ready to start moving into the actual deployment phase. Now, Michael's heard me use this analogy a zillion times, but for some of you it may be new. It's very much like building a new house from scratch. Before you can move into the house has to be finished to a certain degree. So generally that means it has to have windows, walls, doors, and a roof. It would be nice if it had carpets. It would be really nice if it had indoor plumbing and electricity. But at the lowest level, there's sort of a certain minimum level of work that has to be done before the first person can start occupying the house. And the same thing is true with Office 365. So before you can move that first user mailbox, you have to have directory synchronization established if you're going to use it. If you're going to use federation, you have to have that established. You have to think about how you're going to provision mail flow. You have to think about what you're doing around mobile device access. Basically everything that touches how mail flows into or out of your hybrid configuration and how users get data into and out of it. You have to think about that and build it ahead of time before you can start moving or creating new users. And that's hard because just like building a house, you think, man, I want the house to be built so I can paint the kitchen the color I want it and get the nursery set up and build a doghouse for my dog in the backyard. Well, maybe you can do the doghouse because that's not inside the structure of the house, but it wouldn't make sense for you to paint the kitchen before the countertops and cabinets have been installed. So having a very deliberate plan, both to do the deployment and to understand what's been done and verify that it works, is super important. And of course, this last bullet for test and pilot. Michael, I know you've seen deployments where everything seemed to be going smoothly until the pilot began, and then all of a sudden, we can call them surprises, but unexpected circumstances came up. Maybe things were slower than they should have been, or things didn't work the way with users in the system that they did during initial tests, what have you.
Yeah, and that is because, every environment is different, right? I mean, on paper, things should always be the same thing, in the same way. you deploy this, you do that, you click that button, and this happens. And then reality check comes in, and then, oh, right, but we have, attribute XYZ that does this, or, in our environment, we have limitation on dsync, or our user accounts have been created that way, or we cannot change the UPN, or we are using, this type of mobile device that doesn't support mobile device redirection, and that's when all the problems start. So yes, there is, for a lot of customers, I'd say for the majority of the customers, the majority of the features will always behave the same way, and if you implement something and you test something, they have an expected result. And then there is the let's say 20% where the outcome is you don't know what it is until you test it thoroughly with various devices, various users, and it's always different, right? And even then, a good example is Outlook. When you move a mailbox to Office 365, Outlook should normally automatically you get redirected. Now the Discover does or not Discover redirect, gets the new settings, connects to Office 365, and life is grand. But for some reason, and there is no correlation on why this happens, there will always be that one Outlook, and more often than not, it's more than one, that won't do that. And, you click the button repair, or you create a new profile, and it works. So, everything points to it should have done this, but it didn't do that. So there's always, I call it Murphy, is watching over you, and sometimes he just steps in and says, hi. Well, if that happens, then, that's why testing is so important. So, yeah, it's always a surprise, and it's very hard to understand or to know up front. It's impossible to know up front where you'll hit those surprises.
That's what keeps things from getting boring.
Absolutely. That's why I love this job so much.
So once your house is built, to continue that metaphor, then you can start moving into it. So we think of this as a migration phase, and really, depending on your migration, this may be only a small part of or a small percentage of the overall work, because when you think about all the work that has to be done to prepare and test the environment and validate that it works, and then you think about the work that actually has to be done to move users, depending on how many users you have and how you move them, you may find that the migration phase seems to go very quickly by comparison. But there again, as Michael mentioned, testing is super important, because if you think about building the initial environment and putting it through a pilot phase, and then adding users who may be in different geographic locations or running different clients or using different extensions or applications and doing different types of work, you have to verify that everything works for those folks too. So things such as verifying that mail flows where it's supposed to, that you see organizational free busy the right way, that you have OAuth set up correctly if you're using it, that auto discover works. And at the end of the day, the big enchilada is, can users get into the system and do their work? Whatever that work is, whatever clients they're using, whatever their workflow looks like, are they able to do the jobs that the organization requires using the new system? That can take a while to shake out, because in parallel with you testing for, say, the first batch of users who have migrated, you're probably also migrating additional users. There are a lot of different ways to migrate people's mail and files into Exchange Online and SharePoint Online. Lots of different tools. They each have their advantages and disadvantages. But all of them require you to keep tabs on what's actually happening and to monitor the progress of the migration and to be ready to respond to problems. Sometimes that can be more challenging than any other action you have to take. Most of the time, when people are talking about migrating 360 to 365, they do it using a batch-based system. So you identify a group of users who you want to move. You communicate to them that they're going to be moved at a certain time. You schedule that move, you execute the move, then you monitor to see what happened. But there are a whole bunch of nuances around that. For example, a very common scenario where you have an individual user who is the delegate of another user. So the typical boss admin scenarios where you have a boss who has two assistants who work for her. Or increasingly commonly, you have a set of executives or managers who share an assistant. So that assistant has delegate rights on all of their calendars. Well, Office 365 really doesn't like it if you move a delegate without also moving the boss, or vice versa. So one of the key things to know when you're planning your migration batches is, okay, for every user I'm proposing to move, are they the delegate of any other users? And is any other user their delegate? After you've migrated people, how do you know that they've migrated successfully? Well, one way to know is, were they able to log into their mailbox? Have they sent any new mail since the time they were migrated? Have they installed and activated Office 365 Pro Plus, if your licenses include that? The reason that's super important is that as Microsoft moves away from their old model toward a model where salespeople, both inside Microsoft and at partners, are incentivized to get people using Office 365, they're going to want to know what percentage of your users are actually actively using the service, because all of the fast track incentive payments that they make to customers, a lot of the services that are available through vouchers or through offsetting payments that Microsoft makes available, getting that money from Microsoft for your deployment is tied to how quickly your deployment goes and how quickly you have users active on the system. So being able to see what your users are doing and how many of them are active is really important to get that money unlocked. Finally, as you move into the support phase, let's say everything went really smoothly. All your migration work is done. Everybody's on the new system. Everything seems to be going well. But are you able to monitor the same things that you were monitoring before in your on-premises environment? Backups are a great example. If you're doing backups of your existing Exchange system, you probably have some way to tell whether or not those backups completed successfully. You don't necessarily need that when you move to Office 365, because you may not be doing backups any longer, just depending on what's happening with your on-premises mailboxes, if any. But there are other things that you need to monitor that didn't exist before. Michael mentioned DirSync as being a great example. You probably won't have DirSync until you get ready to start moving to hybrid Office 365. If DirSync stops working, there's no immediate obvious impact. Users can still log in to the service, they can still send and receive mail and so on. But if it's not working, the way that you're going to find out is when you create or remove a user and that change doesn't propagate over to the other side. If you hadn't thought about monitoring that before, you should probably start thinking about it now. And the same is true for things like your network connectivity to the service, both between your remote sites, if any, and your primary site. And this last bullet, Microsoft infrastructure, is kind of the real catch-all. Microsoft, they invest tens, probably hundreds of millions of dollars in monitoring the infrastructure that underlies all their services. Office 365, Xbox Live, Bing. But they don't always share that data with the rest of the world. And even if they did, a lot of the data that they have is not meaningful to us. It doesn't matter if I know whether a particular disk drive on an individual physical server at a data center in Chicago has failed. What I really care about is, does that impact my users in some way? Does it prevent them from logging in, etc.? So you have to have some way from your side to proactively watch what Microsoft's environment looks like and to monitor whether it's up or down for your specific users. That's a challenging problem. So Michael, maybe you can start off on the left-hand side here. I don't want to go through all these outages in detail because it would take too long, but maybe you can talk about some of the patterns that we've observed with these outages over the last few years.
Sure. So as you can see on the slide, there have been some outages, right? And one of the things that you can be certain about is that even though they're far and few in between, some outages will occur. But when you take a deeper look at what the cause was of the outages, then most of the times, if not always, for the large-scale ones, there was a certain component involved, and this is Azure Active Directory, right? These outages, when something happens in Azure Active Directory, it prevents you from authenticating. Let's take I think it was June 23rd, or even, let's go to 2015, where there was a mail flow issue in North America, and I think it was during WPC. It wasn't actually a problem in Exchange Online. It was, Exchange Online was affected because Azure AD was behaving badly. So one of the things that you notice there is that, failure of one component can have an impact somewhere else. And then depending on what the cause of the problem is, it can really spread widely. It's been I can't remember, to be honest, when we had a global outage for Office 365, but there have been a few regional outages, like North America has been affected a few times. Early this year, there was this 1 week outage in Europe, and that outage, it wasn't really an outage in terms of that Office 365 was down. Obviously, if it would have been down for a week, that would have been a major disaster. But one of the client protocols, in this case it was IMAP, was unavailable. And for customers using IMAP, that was a pretty big problem, right? Because they couldn't use it. So that brings up all sorts of interesting, issues or interesting thoughts about how to deal with a certain outage when that happens. Now, luckily, again, these are far and few in between, but they do happen, and if they do, it's really important to understand what the impact is on your own environment, or sometimes you're flying blind.
So I want to give Michael a few minutes to talk through some hybrid headaches. This is he's got a lot of them. His war stories are pretty excellent. So I'm going to kind of fade into the background, Michael, and let you run with the ball here for a couple of minutes.
Sure. Thanks, Paul. So this slide kind of started as a little joke earlier, but in essence, when looking at a lot of the problems in Office 365, let me take a step back. It's not a problem in Office 365, but a lot of the hybrid headaches, which are a result of how things work, have to do with the directory synchronization and the way that it's implemented today. So in a way, DirSync is the root of all evil. And the reason for that being is, well, when you take a look at DirSync, the latest version now syncs every 30 minutes. But that means, there is a delay of 30 minutes between you creating an object, that object becoming available in Office 365. Previously, it used to be 3 hours, and actually, until you upgrade to the latest version of AAD Connect, it'll still be 3 hours for you. So this delay causes, users to not be visible right away. It causes an archive that you create for a user not to be available right away. It actually takes 2 synchronization cycles, so at least 1 hour. If you're using older versions, it's up to 6 hours before the archive becomes available. And that is just because, regardless of how you look at it in a hybrid deployment, it's still 2 different environments, right? It's like having 2 completely different on-premises environments, trying to make them work together in a sort of seamless way. And DirSync is a very important part of it, because that's what enables to have these cross-premises experiences the way they are. That is what allows you to email people back and forth. That is what allows you to move mailboxes, and to make sure that everything continues to work after moving mailboxes from one environment to the other one. Now, it is really important that with all the problems that we're going to talk about, that you keep this in mind. And until there is a full 2-way synchronization between on-premises Active Directory and Office 365, there will always be some sorts of issues inherent to the fact that there's only one source of authority, if you will, and that's the on-premises Active Directory. And yes, Microsoft is experimenting, if you will. It's not really experimenting, but they're working on making writeback a possibility that you can deploy on-premises, right? Where you can write back full user accounts, where you can write by groups, and so forth and so on. Well, these features, as we will discuss, they're not generally available, and until these are common practice, I'd say, you'd have to live with the limitations that DirSync imposes into your environment. So here I just explained a few ones, but let's take a look at the hybrid writeback, right? Hybrid recipient management is challenging. Hybrid writeback, as I mentioned, is the cornerstone of the hybrid deployment. By default, if you enable hybrid in Azure AD Connect or DirSync, it writes back 6 or 7 attributes into your on-premises environment to guarantee that coexistence. That in itself is not really hard. It's not something that you have to think about, because it's being configured for you. But in high security environments, I've seen scenarios where permissions couldn't be configured correctly, or where deliberately in Active Directory inheritance of permissions was blocked at an OU level. Well, if that happens, then during the installation of the DirSync tool, the permissions that are required to write back attributes to certain organizational units are not propagated correctly, leading to all sorts of funky issues in DirSync, or funky messages. Now, this isn't something that is hard to solve, but it's a brick wall you can hit pretty quickly, right? Now, looking at what hybrid does and what these hybrid feedback or hybrid writeback features give you, then you have to understand that today it's not supported to do group writeback. It is there. It's a preview feature. You can use it and it works. There are some quirks, but in the end, if you use it in production, then you're kind of on your own. So I consider it to be a sort of feature gap, especially Office 365 groups. Hugely popular feature, great solution, and I think this is maybe the alternative that we're looking forward to. Maybe someday replace public folders. And I know some people will be laughing here, but yeah, I think there's a lot of value to be found in the groups. But they only exist in Office 365, and we know that they're not going to be available on premises. So how are you going to bring those groups into the on-premises environment? Well, today you can create contacts yourself in the on-premises environment, which have an email or for which the email address matches the Office 365 group. Or you could enable the group writeback. If you do, then effectively all these Office 365 groups get created in a special organizational unit on premises, and life should be good. However, for some reason, the on-premises exchange doesn't always natively recognize these groups, and you have to update the recipient after the synchronization happens, and then they will show up in the global address list on premises. And this mainly has to do with the version of Exchange that you have deployed on premises. So it means that there is a challenge dealing with these hybrid recipients. And it's not just these hybrid recipients in terms of Office 365 groups, it's pretty much anything. As soon as you have, cloud-only users, then, those are completely oblivious to the on-premises environment. This is also why in a on-premises or in a hybrid deployment, your source of authority is your on-premises environment, and anything you do should be done through the on-premises servers, creating a new user. Now, interestingly, I was talking to one of my colleagues earlier today and was describing how he created a new user in the environment. And he said, well, I created the user account, and then I created a mailbox in Office 365, and then Justin came in, and all sorts of funky stuff happened. Well, because of the way that Dursync works, the way that you should treat a new user is basically you create an on-premises user, and then either you create an on-premises mailbox and you move that mailbox to Office 365, or easier, you create the user and you remote mailbox enable that user in Office 365, and then you sync that over. Why is that important? Well, you have to make sure that in the entire flow of attributes, the on-premises object represents the cloud object with all its attributes in the right way, which means that certain attribute values have to be X, Y, or Z on premises, and they represent a different object type in Office 365. So a mailbox in Office 365 is a remote mailbox on premises, and vice versa. Now, interestingly enough, it wouldn't be, it wouldn't be fun if there weren't any exceptions. A shared mailbox is one of them. So you can create an on-premises remote mailbox for a user, which means that you create a user account, you tell Exchange, hey, I'm going to create a user account, a mailbox in the cloud, but you don't have to create the mailbox first. And that works well. Now, you cannot create a remote shared mailbox. So theoretically, the process to deal with a new shared mailbox in a hybrid deployment is to create an on-premises shared mailbox and then move it to Office 365. Or, and this is kind of like a little bit of a painful situation, where you create an on-premises user account that represents the shared mailbox, and then you create a shared mailbox in Office 365, and you use soft matching to match them together. And then in order to make sure that the on-premises account is actually representing the correct attribute in Office 365, you have to use ADSI edit to modify the MS Exchange recipient type, and then life is good. Well, by hearing me talk about it, it should frighten you having to do that. And I fully agree. It shouldn't be that hard. But unfortunately, until, some of these problems get fixed, or maybe until we get a new shared mailbox -remote commandlet, this is the harsh reality that we live in. And again, it's a result, or a direct result of directory synchronization and how the process works. Now, I'm fully confident that over time, this process will get a lot better, but it is what we have to deal with today. And lastly, and I know I keep telling you that I won't talk a lot about this, but restoring objects is kind of a little bit of a problem. And it's not really a problem, but you have to understand how it works. Just like in the on-premises environment, a mailbox or a signed-in Office 365, or objects inside are linked to a user account in Azure Active Directory, and that account in itself is then linked to an on-premises account. And long story short, if the account on-premises is gone, then the user in Office 365 or in Azure AD goes away, and then everything associated with that user gets away as well. In the end, regardless of the situation that you're in, the easiest or the best way is to just revive the object on premises, make sure that it's the same object. As a result, the deleted or soft deleted object in Azure Active Directory gets revived as well, and as a result, the mailbox and all the other stuff that used to belong to that user account are revived automatically as well. So that is typically, some things that you have to keep in mind, because if you don't really realize how everything fits together, right, how everything is linked together, you could end up in a situation where you delete a user account, or where you delete a user in Azure Active Directory and then throw it away from the recycle bin and actually lose data because of that. So those are, intricacies that are really important to deal with. So now that we've covered some of these hybrid headaches, if you will, and there's plenty more where that came from, believe me, Paul, why don't we talk a little bit about what we can do to help you there?
Absolutely. Thank you for that, Michael. Those are some pretty serious headaches, but luckily we have some extra strength pain reliever to help with that. So Mailscape 365 is the only product on the market right now that integrates both monitoring and reporting, and that ties together being able to see what's happening in the on-premises environment that you currently have, as well as being able to see what's happening with the service components that you're purchasing from Microsoft. This makes it possible for you to manage outages instead of having them manage you, and to be able to see what's happening, who's using what resources, and how that resource usage pattern changes over time to help minimize the amount of money you spend on support and to keep your users happy. So we talked earlier about the support phase being kind of the challenging, sustaining phase that you have to go through. What Mailscape 365 helps you do is keep on top of things to proactively control how you respond to outages when they occur, know that they happen before your users start calling you. Nobody likes getting a phone call from a user telling them, hey, I looked on Twitter and I saw it looks like Office 365 is down and I can't log into my mailbox. We've had some discussions with the support folks at Microsoft, and they said that 50+% of the calls that they get are actually due to issues on the customer side. So they're not problems with Microsoft Data Center or services, but Microsoft gets a support call anyway. And so what that means is that if you experience an issue and you can't tell whether it's your issue or Microsoft's issue, you're probably going to waste some time calling Microsoft essentially on a coin flip that it might be their problem. We can help you eliminate those coin flips by making it very clear where the problem is, whether it's your problem or theirs. So, Michael, maybe you can quickly summarize some of the network tests that we do, and then we'll blitz through these pretty quickly. You and I have spent a lot of time with the background, and now have to make up a bit of time. So.
Sure, absolutely. So one of the network tests, or not one of the network tests, but when you look at Office 365, networking is the core. Without access to Office 365 through the internet, through your network, things don't work. Now you can take two approaches. You can do the full network approach where you monitor all the bits and pieces in between, or you can literally take the high road, the layer 7 approach. It's what we do. We establish connections to various endpoints in Office 365, service-specific endpoints for Exchange, Skype for Business, the portal, even the supporting services like Getting Web Service that is being used by Azure AD Connect and so forth. And we make sure that we can bind to those endpoints, that those are available, which means that we test the full path, and we don't take a look at a specific component there, right? Which means that if you block that access to that, to that endpoint through a firewall, then our test would fail. Now, being able to connect is one thing. Another thing that we do is we measure how long it takes us to connect. Now, latency. Now, latency is really important because it relates one-on-one to the end user experience, right? High latency usually means bad end user experience. Low latency means it's acceptable and really good. Theoretically, you'll always want your latency to be as close to 0 milliseconds as possible, and over time to see a flat line, but that's not reasonable. But the value that you're getting from monitoring network connectivity is, first of all, making sure that all your bases are covered, and you get insights into how the connectivity is performing, as a result, what your end user experience looks like. Now, what we do with that latency is we capture that for each of the tests that we do. We store that over a historical period of time, and then we have our network trending reports. It's an interactive dashboard where you can go in and you can take a look at the up to the minute information about, hey, someone called in, it's slow. You can actually have a look at what slow means, because my interpretation of slow is different from yours, and you can maybe spot a spike in latency connectivity, which means that, yes, there is absolutely something wrong. There is something that's happening right now, and it allows you to quantify that, usually very subjective feeling that someone has when they tell you that things are rather slow. So we allow you to take a look at the detailed versions, which give you all the measure points that we collect. Or if you want to know what your latency has been over a longer period of time, we do these averages, or the daily averages, where we roll up all the results from a day, graph it out over a longer period of time, and then you can really see what the trends are for latency. Is it stable? Is it going down, which obviously is good, or is it going up? Maybe you can spot a very high peaks on a daily basis or even a monthly basis, which can tell you that there's network congestion, there's something, another process that was using bandwidth and so forth and so on. So that's why, from a networking perspective, it's really important that you can see all those angles. And then, of course, last but not least, you don't want to do this only from within your data center, because your users aren't sitting inside the data center. They're anywhere but in the data center. So what we have are these remote probes, which you can deploy inside your corporate headquarters in all your satellite offices, and they will execute the same set of tests, network connectivity tests and also the functionality tests, to Office 365, so that you can see whether it's a site-related issue, a global issue, or maybe a regional issue, and have all that information surfaced to you in these trending reports that we have.
Excellent. We're really proud of the remote probe architecture, because it gives you a great deal of visibility into exactly what's happening in your environment as an end user would experience. So it's really helpful to monitor Office 365 connectivity from your main data center. Nobody disputes that. But unless all your users happen to be in the same physical building on the same physical network subnet as your Office 365 interconnects, you may find that someone in a remote office, in a field office, has a very different experience in terms of what their network performance looks like, in terms of the uptime they see, and so on. We have a couple of large customers who use these probes at various locations throughout the world. It's very common before installing our probes that their network operations center or help desk would get a call from a customer in Africa or the Middle East or Southeast Asia or South America. They would say, hey, Office 365 is down. Why is my department paying all this money for the service that you provide when we can't even get into it? Well, when the help desk gets that call, what are they going to do? They don't have any way directly to see what kind of performance the user in that location is experiencing. But with our remote probe architecture, they actually do have a way to see exactly that data. So the remote probes help you see what end users see by monitoring the same types of operations that the clients themselves perform. This is super important, because we don't just monitor the availability of an IP address and say, oh, I can ping it, that means the service is up. We log into the endpoint using the same protocols that the client does and verify that, yep, I can log in, I can send a message, I can receive a message, depending on the test, of course, to give you real-time, real data about whether or not users in that location are able to use those services. So if you have a location-specific problem, you can isolate it fairly quickly. If it's a problem with your users in one location, with the access to Office 365 in one location, or if it's systemic, we're able to tell you that. And then, as Michael mentioned, we can gather that data over time and turn it into trend data that you can use to keep an eye on what's happening as your network and service change and evolve. Now, I want to talk briefly about reporting. So far we've mostly been talking about service monitoring, which is super important. But reporting is the other strength of our product. The big advantage that we bring here is that we gather a lot of data that Microsoft doesn't directly expose in their Office 365 data mart. Now, you may know that Microsoft just announced that they're making some changes in the new Office 365 admin portal. And basically what those changes mean is they've taken away a bunch of reports they used to have until such time as they can replace them. So they're really aware that there's a need for reporting, but the problem is that the reporting that they do is optimized around reporting on resource consumption, which is useful but not sufficient all by itself, and it's optimized around data that Microsoft thinks will be useful to the majority of customers. The problem with that is that every single one of our customers, without exception, that I've talked to, has very specific requirements around reports that are unique to their environment. And so the ability to be able to go in and pick exactly the report you need with the duration and time scale you need and the thing that you're monitoring that you need is really important. So having a broad selection of reports to choose from is critical. And that's an area where Microsoft, frankly, hasn't delivered yet. So in addition to the reports Michael mentioned earlier, where you can, for example, look at a graph of latency data over time to see how it's changing, being able to go in at any point in your deployment process and look to see where are the major users of a particular resource? Where are my biggest mailboxes? Who sends the most messages? Who makes the most Skype calls? Who's using the most Skype conferences? Where are my heavy SharePoint users? Where are the biggest SharePoint sites? Being able to gather that data is critical to planning and organizing a smooth migration. And then when you're in the operating phase and the sustaining phase, being able to go back and look and see how those things have changed over time is very important as well. So I put this slide together very quickly to show some example reports of the kinds of things that people want to know about with Exchange Online, because that's a primary workload that most people start with in 365. So things like how are mailbox sizes changing over time? How much mail flow am I seeing in and out of the system, and who are my heaviest users? What's happening with mobile devices? You know, those are the kind of questions that don't go away just because you move to a cloud-hosted environment. You still need to know those things because they impact what your users are able to do and how efficiently your service can support them. Now for SharePoint Online, you know, this is a growing area of interest because if Exchange Online is the first workload that people move to, SharePoint Online and in particular OneDrive are very quickly becoming the second most common workload. Because when people see, hey, wait a minute, I could potentially get rid of all my existing on-prem file servers, I could move users' home directories to this environment, it sounds like a pretty good deal. But in order for that to be useful to you, there's a lot of data that you're probably going to want to have about OneDrive. Who's using it, who's sharing things, how much data are they sharing, what's in your SharePoint team sites and who has access to them, and so forth. So we provide some pretty in-depth reports here to give you good visibility into that part of your environment too. And then finally, Skype. So Skype is critically important now that Microsoft is starting to ship calling features that truly allow you to replace your on-prem PBX system with Skype Online. I refer to that kind of jokingly as phone calls from heaven, because as long as you have to keep on-premises components, that diminishes some of the value of moving to any online workload. If you think about being able to have Skype completely hosted out of the cloud so that all your users have a phone number that rings on whatever device they happen to be logged into, wherever they happen to be, as long as they're connected to the internet, that's a pretty big deal. But in order for that to be a cost-effective and useful solution, you need to know what's happening. Right? How often are people using this service? How many minutes on average are they using? That's important, for example, if you think about pricing Microsoft's PSTN calling options. And you want to know, do I have users who are likely to go over the minutes threshold for those plans? There again, that's another whole category of information that we unlock and make visible in the Mailscape 365 reporting suite. Finally, I just want to close with a couple of quotes. We find that customers such as Baltimore City Public Schools and Barbary, when they start looking at the breadth of value that Mailscape 365 gives them, because it combines monitoring with reporting, and it gives you a single pane of glass that shows you what's happening for your on-premises hybrid resources, as well as your infrastructure components such as DirSync and ADFS, and then extends into monitoring whether the service is up or down and from where. And then when you combine that with the reporting stuff, there's no other solution like it on the market. So we're pretty proud of it, and I encourage you to drop by enowsoftware.com, take a look, or sign up for a test drive. Whew, boy, I need a Diet Coke after all this, Michael. Anything you want to say as we wrap up and get ready to move on?
No. I think we've summarized it pretty well. I think the key point is I think we hammered it quite a bit as gaining that visibility because things are so different is really important whether you are in a full cloud deployment, whether you are in a hybrid deployment. There's all these different points that have that require your attention. So having something that can give you that visibility or ease of mind, which is important too, is really important though.
Great. Well, thank you, Michael, for your insights and your headaches. And thanks to everybody for attending.
Well, thank you, Paul, and thank you, Michael, for all of your insights into getting your users to Office 365 and keeping them happy. And of course, we want to thank eNow as a returning Platinum sponsor. And as a reminder to all of our attendees, the next focus session will be starting very shortly. And the link for that session can be found in your confirmation email or at the Twitter hashtag Office365EXCHCON. That's hashtag Office365EXCHCON. Thanks, everyone, and we'll see you again real soon.